All right. Can you? Actually, I got it. Oh. Got it.
Do you want me to stand?
Yep. Go ahead and stand. Let me make sure this is set up well. All right. Yeah, this is great. Okay.
Yeah, this is not the greatest angle. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for coming.
You were smart. You have a raincoat.
No, thank you for coming in. I really appreciate it. No, actually, we sold the tickets. We're just trying to prep for this.
Probably
Yeah.
for the best.
Yeah.
Probably for the best. Good luck.
Thank you.
Sorry.
I took a 3-hour nap on Saturday. That sounds glorious. It was pretty good. Yeah. No, he did not. Yeah. So we read I was jet lagged. Yeah.
How's it going?
You're gonna kill it. You are gonna kill it.
Okay, cool. Did you bring all the various forms?
I think so.
Great, cool.
Yeah, we went to the It's huge. I've seen it.
All right. Rachel's there.
It's kind of expensive. But he liked it. I went to Sounds like it was fun. I did this reason that my dad had in my hotel for my office. I mean, it was like $13. Which is like it's kind of steep for a first. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's like right? Well, I just didn't think. So I was still walking while I was standing there just I'm just happy with that way. I was like, without even steps. No, unfortunately, first it's hard. So I just do this and get steps. Yeah. And then the reception's back so much. Hey, Sam.
We don't have to wait for information in 5 minutes.
Yeah, I'm gonna say a couple words. I'm actually in the lieutenancy temporarily, but Okay, hi. So welcome everybody to Sarah's defense. So I'm actually standing in for Malou Tanzi, who's the Senior Director of Graduate Studies. So members of the Emory program will hear me say the same speech that that Malou normally says, which is that welcome to the public part of Sarah's defense. So Sarah's going to tell us about the amazing work she's been doing over the last few years. And then after that, there will be a private examination with just the members of her thesis committee. So in sort of the public part, anybody can ask questions except for those of us on the thesis committee. We're asked to hold our questions until afterwards. And now to further introduce Sarah, here's Krish.
Thanks, Sam. So it's a pleasure to be here in person to introduce my grad student, Sara, who's worked with me and Lynn Nygaard for the past nearly 5 years. I'll keep this fairly brief because I think you all have come to listen to her and not to me. Sara grew up in the town of Norris, Tennessee, graduated from high school there, and then came to Emory to do her undergraduate studies. I first got to meet her, I think, when she took a class that I co-taught with Laura Otis, a class that explored the intersections between neuroscience and literature. And as you can see, some of that interest is carried through into her PhD dissertation work. Sara ended up her undergraduate career double majoring in neuroscience and creative writing, and then joined our neuroscience program. So we've been very happy to have her in our lab, and as I said, she's continued to explore the intersection between neuroscience and words and meaning, and that's what she's going to tell us about today. Sara.
Thank you, Krish, for that generous and long-awaited introduction. I am so happy to be up here today to tell you about some of my work. I'm going to just turn on the microphone there. That might be a little bit easier for people to hear. First, I just want to thank everyone for being here to listen to what has been a 5+ year journey into the exploration of the sound of meaning, perceptual, physical, and neural correlates of sound to shape mapping in natural language. I hope that by the end of this talk that everybody will have some idea of what I did, and also some of the details, but also some of the people that have helped me along the way. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. So we're going to walk through 4 parts of this talk to kind of anchor everybody. We're going to start with the perceptual phenomena that we study. We're going to move into a description of the physical parameters of that perceptual phenomena. We're going to talk about some of the neural correlates of that phenomena, and then we're going to end with how this varies across individuals. So we'll come back to this a couple of different times. But before I get into exactly what the perceptual phenomena is, I want to introduce everybody to what is a fundamental property of language. So we're interested in how perception and language interact. And one thing that's important to understand is that arbitrariness is an assumed part of human language, such that there's not a necessary inherent connection between the sounds that you use to talk about, the sounds that you use to create a word and the actual referent of that word. So here I have in a few different languages the same word for a specific referent, and it's possible that if you looked at the German, you might get an idea of what that word is, and it's dog in English. Something that you might have noticed too is that a few of these sounds across languages are maybe a little bit familiar, especially for the German Hund. You could maybe extrapolate to hound in English. So it's possible that there may be some non-arbitrariness in language. There are many actually examples of exceptions to the rule of arbitrariness, which include onomatopoeia. So that's making a sound to represent a sound that an animal makes. So in this case, we're talking about dogs to represent their bark. In English, it's woof, but I like some of these. So this is the Spanish wow, hum, bow. But all of these sounds actually seem to, all of these words in some way seem to kind of represent the sound that a dog makes. So it seems that there may be, in some cases, a connection between sound and meaning. And we study a particular type of connection between sound and meaning, which is sound symbolism, which refers to the idea that vocal sounds can carry inherent meaning. Now, there are a lot of different examples of sound symbolism. It's actually a very broad topic, which makes the entire phenomena a little bit difficult to study. So what we do is, so we ask the question, how do we then study sound symbolism systematically? We use sound symbolic cross-modal correspondences. So now I'm going to introduce another thing. Cross-modal correspondences are consistent associations between seemingly unrelated visual and auditory features. And the specific type that we're going to be talking about is the, well, what we call the Ketse-Molo effect today. So this is a fairly robust phenomena in which if you give someone a pointed looking shape like this, and you ask them, is it a noun word such as kete versus a noun word such as molo, most people will choose the kete for a pointed looking shape like this, and the molo for a rounded looking shape such as this one here. Now this is a fairly robust phenomena. It's seen in individuals across different language backgrounds, children pre-reading age, and even infants and children. So we have here a very specific studyable phenomena that is pretty robust. And we're going to talk about some of these ideas, but just to kind of give a little bit of teaser, studying sound symbolic cross-modal correspondences could give us insight into a lot of different things, including evolution of language and perception and behavior, which is one that we're interested in. But also there's a little work in advertising which I encourage you to look at because I find it kind of interesting. The idea that you can change a product's name and hopefully the advertisers are getting you to think that the chips are crispy and not soft. So I encourage you to look at that at some point. So our overarching question here is, why is there non-arbitrariness in language? So arbitrariness, because it is so pervasive, it gives us some advantages. So it allows us to have very wide vocabularies to describe many different ideas, including abstract ones. So then why are these odd non-arbitrary, or seemingly non-arbitrary, kinds of mappings in language? And we're going to use, like I described, sound symbolic cross-modal correspondences to kind of explore that question and dig a little bit deeper. We're going to do that in from 3 different angles here. We're going to start with what are the sort of physical properties that might elicit this kind of sound symbolic mapping. We're going to look at some of the neural correlates behind that phenomena. And then we're going to look at individual variation across the population. So we'll come back to this, but just kind of give everyone an idea. So I've talked to you about the perceptual phenomena that we look at, sound symbolic cross-modal correspondences. Now we're interested here in talking about what are the physical properties that might elicit this. So in order for you to have a perceptual phenomena, you have to have an input stimulus from your environment most of the time. And so what are these, what are the physical stimuli that will elicit this? And we're going to come back here now to the definition of cross-modal correspondences, which is that these are seemingly unrelated visual and auditory features. So we turn that definition around to really ask the question, is there a consistent set of physical features in auditory space that could then relate to a set of features in visual space to elicit cross-modal correspondences? And we did that in 4 separate steps. Don't worry, this is a huge figure. We're going to walk through it step by step. But just to give you an idea of what we did, we started with creating a reference using perceptual judgments. We went to step 2 where we compared our references using a method called representational similarity analysis. I'll get to what that is in a moment. We then compared our references with different physical properties of our stimuli. And then we compared those properties cross-modally. So we'll walk through this step by step, but that's essentially what we did. And by doing this, we hope to investigate the conditions under which sound symbolic cross-modal correspondences can be elicited. So I'll start first with our sound symbolic judgments. So I have to give a lot of credit here to Kelly McCormick, a former graduate student in the NIGARD lab, who had developed a very systematically developed set of stimuli. These shapes, there were 90 of them that varied from pointed to rounded, and there were 537 pseudo-words that she recorded herself using all of the available sounds in the English language and all of the consonant-vowel combinations that were not real English words. So she did a lot of work in that, and she also did a majority of the work in which we asked 30 raters in the visual shapes and 31 separate raters in the pseudo-words to take these pseudo-words or shapes and rate them from pointed to rounded. So this was a lot of work that went into developing our reference point, or what are the shapes and what are the pseudo-words that people will consistently rate as pointed or rounded. These are just a few more of the shapes here that are from the set. So we've got our raters who have rated all of these shapes and sounds from pointed to rounded. Now how do we organize all of these? And we use something called representational similarity analysis. Our ultimate goal in step 2 is to be able to compare the judgments from the shapes and from the sounds. But first I need to explain to you what these graphs are that we're looking at. This is a representational dissimilarity matrix. We've got 2 of them here. And you are able to use RSA, representational similarity analysis, to compare across stimulus categories. And to just break it down a little bit more, let's start with the pseudo-word perceptual judgment. So contained in this entire graph is some representation of all of those pseudo-word judgments across all 31 participants. And let me just back up and say that you have the pseudo-words rated, organized from pointed to rounded on the axes here, and each of these little cells is a comparison of one pseudo-word's rating to the other pseudo-word's rating. Here in the color, you have a measurement of the dissimilarity that ranges from 0 to 2. So in other words, how similar were the ratings between one pseudo-word and another. And then, so let's start with a cell up here in the top right. And if you were to expand what's inside that cell, you'd see the correlation of ratings between 2 pseudo-words across participants. So a single dot is a single participant's rating for Keke, mapped along this axis, and mapped along this axis is the rating, that participant's ratings for Kete. You can take all of our participants and then do a Pearson correlation to see that you can see that they're positively correlated, so the R is 0.69 in this case. And since we're looking at dissimilarity, we transform that into 1 minus R, or 0.31, which is giving us sort of a blue color you can see in the scale here. So that makes sense because Kete and Keke are both sort of pointed pseudo-words. And then on the right here, we're now comparing the same pseudo-word here, Keke, now versus Momo, which is one of our more rounded pseudo-words. And same idea, these are the participants' ratings, and the R value is negative 0.67, and 1 minus R, 1.67, which gives us up in the red here. So you can kind of get an idea now of what representational similarity analysis is able to show us. It's really able to just condense a whole lot of information into one sort of pattern. And when you're able to compare then 2 different RDMs, you can also compare the patterns that they make across, in this case we're talking about judgments. So we have the pseudo-words, the shapes, perceptual judgments on the left, and the auditory pseudo-word perceptual judgments on the right. And you can kind of see how there seems to be maybe a cluster of pointed shapes and a cluster of rounded shapes. You can see maybe a similar pattern in the pseudo-words. You can see sort of a block here of blue that's the pointed, and the block here of red that are the rounded. But the interesting part about the pseudo words is maybe there's a little bit more noise in the middle. Now we want to ask, okay, how similar are these? You can kind of visually see that, but how do we quantify that? Well, we then take a second order correlation of all the unique categories or the unique values in this and in this RDM, and we can quantify how similar they are. The value would range from -1 to 1, and we can see that the value is 0.66. So these are fairly similar these are fairly similar judgments across two different modalities. And I'm going to back up just a second and say modality is just referring to a sense. So visual modality is seeing, auditory modality is hearing. I'm going to use that word several times, so I want to make sure I explain that. So we talked about RSA, which allows us to compare across similar categories, and we used it to establish that there is high similarity between perceptual judgments for visual shapes and perceptual judgments for auditory pseudowords. And then, so this finding may suggest that maybe there's some connection between certain ones of these shapes and certain pseudowords. We showed that in the perceptual domain as our reference, but now we want to ask, again, what are the physical features in auditory space that relate to a set of features in visual space to elicit cross-modal correspondences? So we've got our got our ratings, we've got our visual and our auditory perceptual judgments, our reference points, and now we're going to move into step 3, in which we take our reference in a single modality and compare it to actual physical measurements that we made of our stimuli. So we did that for the visual shapes, and we also did that with the auditory pseudowords. So let's start with the visual shapes. We wanted to look at visual properties that may correlate with our perceptual ratings. So we assessed a lot of different visual properties, 6 ones, and 3 of them were significant. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go into what each of those properties were, but let's just take one example, which was silhouette. So you can see here are a couple of examples of our shapes, and what we did essentially was take a silhouette of that shape. It's a series of zeros and ones, if you can imagine sort of a 2D matrix here, and we turned it into 1 dimension, and that became our visual property RDM on the right. So in this case it would be for silhouette, and then we compared that again with our visual perceptual ratings.
Explain that in a little bit more detail. So you had a binary matrix for each, and you're looking at cross correlation between them. What property is captured by silhouette?
So in the case of silhouette, we're essentially taking this shape and we're transforming it into a set of zeros and ones, which is in a 2-dimensional space. And in order for us to use RSA, we actually have to turn it into a 1-dimensional space. So what silhouette is in this case capturing is where is the shape in our set. So so if you were to compare the matrix, compare the 1-dimensional matrix between this one and this one, you would find areas where this was 0 and this was 1 and vice versa, and in that way you're getting sort of a very condensed version of what is the shape that you're eliciting. Does that answer your question?
Well, yeah, but I mean, algorithmically, what are you doing to the numbers to get this? Because you need a single number for the visual property measurement. So
right.
what
Well,
do you do
actually,
to the
no, you don't, and maybe that wasn't clear from my original explanation. So when we were talking about the properties, all of these we make. There is a single number. I'll take that back. There's a single number in the Pearson correlation that then we transform into dissimilarity.
Right.
When it comes to the actual information that goes into create that or compute that correlation, you can actually you need measurements for the pseudo word or the shape to match up to each other. So you can have either one measurement between the two, or you can have multiple measurements. Does that make sense?
I think so, but this is about just the visual property. There's no ratings in here. Not in this one, but
Not in this one, no.
right. So it's just about the physical properties of
So this one is all about physical properties, and this is all about the perceptual judgments. Right. And so we're able to compare between them.
Okay.
Okay.
Right.
And then, so we also looked at a similar thing with the pseudo words. So we took our perceptual judgment reference, and then we took at different auditory properties. We actually looked at 11 different properties, 6 of which were significant, 5 of which were significant. And just one example of a property that we looked at was speech envelope. So here is the waveform of a pseudo word. And below, this is one of the pointed pseudo words, kete, and below you can actually see speech envelope, which is here you've got the amplitude for each at each point of across time for kete, and the amplitude across time for momo. And what we do is we end up putting all of that information into a representational dissimilarity matrix, and then we compare this the speech envelope information across all of our pseudo words organized thusly in the auditory property, and compare it to our perceptual judgment reference point. Alright, so now we have created our reference. We have used representational similarity analysis to compare our references across modality. We've looked within modality, looking at visual perceptual judgments compared to different physical properties of the stimulus. We've looked at different auditory perceptual judgments, looking at different auditory properties. And now we want to be able to take our visual properties and our auditory properties and compare them cross-modally. So that's represented here as well. And we compared we compared 2 of our different auditory properties and 2 of our different visual properties. And you can see here that the ones that I highlighted, which I find easier to visualize, silhouette and speech envelope, when compared cross-modally were not important for cross-modal understanding, but for the simple matching coefficient and the fast Fourier transform, these were important for perceiving cross-modal connection. So why does this matter? Our question was to probe the definition, the seemingly unrelated visual and auditory features of sound-symbolic cross-modal correspondences. And we found that there are consistent features in visual space that may be correlated with perceptual understanding of rounded and pointed, and also in the auditory space that there may be certain properties that are correlated with rounded and pointed. However, not all properties that are important for one modality are necessarily important for the cross-modal mapping between the two, between audition and vision. So I'm going to go ahead and now start talking about, change direction a little bit and start talking about the neural correlates of this. So we've explored some of the physical space that might elicit sound-symbolic cross-modal correspondences. And now we're going to go ahead and talk about some of the neural properties or neural correlates that may be important for sound-symbolic cross-modal correspondences. So broadly, our question was, which particular areas of the brain might functionally correlate with processing sound to meaning cross-modal correspondences? And I want to give people just a little bit of a visual of what we were doing. So we took human participants and politely asked them to put their head in this giant machine. And thank you to Kate Parag-Revel for doing a lot of work mentoring me and allowing me to be an MRI operator for our experience. And so we collected some information from that in order to get information about what was going on in their brains while they were listening to sounds and seeing shapes, or in some cases both. So we end up then with some brain images, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And I also want to point out again Kelly McCormick, who had started some of this work, really pioneered, and she looked at also different types of cross-modal correspondences, and I want to give some credit to her there. And then I finally want wanted to say that by identifying the areas of the brain that may be important for perceiving sound symbolic cross-modal correspondences, we can then try to make functional inferences over why we make these associations. I'm going to say fMRI is a correlational approach, so this is not causal, but we're interested in the correlations. So just like we had in the physical part of the talk, in the neural part of the talk, we sort of had an extended pipeline, and this might give you an idea of what our participants did, some of which are in the room, and we thank you immensely for doing this procedure. They actually came in 3 separate times for 3 separate 2-hour sessions, so we had some real veterans by the end of this experiment. And so we started with perceptual judgments, just like we did in the first part of the talk. We took actually a subset of our pseudo words, so instead of using all 537 pseudo words as we did in the first part, we took only 12, and we had them rate from pointed to rounded, and we took only 12 shapes as well and had them rate from pointed to rounded, and we did select these based on the ratings from the previous group so that we hypothesized that they would vary from pointed to rounded based on the set of ratings from the first group. So that was our reference point, and they did this outside of the scanner. And then we had them do a visual session inside the scanner. So we got some images from them. This is just a representational model. This is not results. And we had them look at these 12 different shapes presented at different time periods. And they were only seeing one at a time. And they were just actually asking themselves, really, had they seen the same shape twice in a row? We were trying to maintain attention because it was very long tasks, and we wanted to make sure that they were actually processing these different shapes. And then similarly for the auditory session, so for those 12 pseudo words that we selected, we had them listening to the pseudo words and pressing a button when they heard the same pseudo word twice in a row. And then they did a multisensory session. Now the task for that was a little bit interesting. So we had auditory visual pairs presented simultaneously, and they were deciding whether these match or mismatch. So the expectation is that they would choose, when they heard pete in conjunction with a pointed shape like this, or molo with a rounded shape like this, that they would choose one button to signify match, those matched, and vice versa in the mismatch condition. If they saw this shape and they heard molo, they saw this shape and they heard pete, they would choose the opposite button, mismatch. And what's interesting, and I'm also going to sometimes refer to these as incongruent and congruent for match condition. So interestingly, we did not tell our participants which shapes and sounds should go together. We just told them that you would hear simultaneous sound and image, and that you would have to decide whether they go together or they don't go together. And I got a lot of really strange looks, especially when I let them have a short practice session over it. People were wondering if this was some sort of psychological trick. Maybe we were studying, something like trust or something. No, we weren't. But surprisingly, 23 of our 24 participants decided that match was this congruent condition and mismatch was the incongruent condition. So I thought that was really interesting, just as sort of a proof of principle here. So, did we at least replicate what we found in the physical part of the talk? With 12 stimuli, we did. So the participants that rated our 12 shapes now and our 12 pseudo words did decide that they varied on a scale of rounded to pointed, and we got a very similar pattern when we look at the RDM for the shapes and the pseudo words, and the group at the group level, the value, the connection between the shapes and the pseudo words. How similar are these two patterns? That second order correlation was 0.63, which was close to 0.66 in our original 2 sets of individuals. So now we've shown within subject, we can replicate these results with just 12 of our stimuli. And so now I want to go into what was happening in the unisensory or the unimodal case. Previous work actually has not taken a look at exactly what happens during the unisensory perception of stimuli that could lead to sound symbolic cross-modal correspondences. And I'll say that too, I want to just sort of go over what we're looking at here first. We have 3 different views of the same brain, and this is actually, some people get confused here. So this is a graphical representation. We're not actually able to see what lights up in the brain when we put someone in a scanner. This is actually, you can see some little yellow dots here, and those are areas mapped onto an image in which we have found areas that are preferring one experimental condition over another. So in this particular case, we're looking at areas that prefer the visual presentation of our stimuli over a baseline condition where they are just lying there looking at a fixation cross. So I just want to point that out as a caveat here. And so in addition to that, we are also correlating the average perceptual rating, so what we saw back here, we're correlating the average perceptual rating to the contrast or the preference of visual stimuli over baseline. And so this is a result that we got in the visual session. There were others that I'm not going to spend the time yet to go into unless there are questions. But we'll start here with the visual session where we've got both left and right supramarginal gyrus. And left supramarginal gyrus particularly was interesting because that has been correlated with language function, auditory processing. So that's kind of cool because they're just looking at shapes at this point. And then, so you might think, well, maybe we would have gotten that in the auditory case, and that actually didn't happen. But we did get an area that is known to be important for visual function. Exactly what to make of this, there are a lot of possibilities. One is that perhaps individuals are in some way engaging the opposite, if you will, or the other sense. When they are, in one case, listening to pseudo words, or in the other case, watching visual shapes. Maybe they are, in fact, performing this type of mapping even when we're not asking them to. So we showed that there are areas in which our perceptual judgments correlate with the neural response in both the auditory and the visual modality. And perhaps this suggests that that the visual and the auditory modality are somehow involved in processing sound symbolic cross-modal correspondences, even in the absence, or even in the unisensory case. And so now we're sort of getting to the maybe exciting part, which is the multisensory session. And just to remind everyone that their task was selecting match and mismatch. And so what we did was we found areas that preferred congruent over incongruent stimuli, or trials in which that they were selecting congruent versus incongruent. And this crosshair is centered on a hotspot of our largest and most diffuse area, which spanned from the precentral to postcentral gyrus. And so that was actually kind of surprising for us, because especially the precentral gyrus is known for motor function. I'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment. And our second largest area is actually something that we hypothesized in the left superior temporal gyrus. That's important for,
oh, hey, sorry, just one question about your brains. Are we looking at an atlas brain, or are we looking at someone's brain?
Oh, that's a great question. So I'll just back up and say that this is an average cortical mass of all of our 24 participants. So it's not an atlas. We do have MNI coordinates of all of these areas, which I'd be happy to bring up after the talk if you're interested. But yes, that's a good point. That the brain anatomy of this particular image is just an average across our participants.
Gotcha, thank you.
Yeah. And so the second largest area was maybe in some way expected just based on previous research, but it was nice to know that we got this in the left posterior superior temporal gyrus, because this is actually good to be able to, in science, replicate the findings of others, so that we can be more sure that our findings are accurate. So just to sort of summarize, some of the functions that were attributed to these areas included visual, auditory, and multisensory processing, language processing, and motor function. So why does this matter? Again, I said this at the beginning of this talk, or at the beginning of this part of the talk, that by identifying areas that are important for perceiving sound symbolic cross-modal correspondences, we can try to make some inferences over why we're making these associations. I'll also summarize to say that we looked at a perceptual reference outside of the scanner. We looked at a unisensory visual, a unisensory auditory, and a multisensory session inside of the magnetic resonance imaging machine to identify neural correlates. In the perceptual case, we established that there was a pointed to rounded spectrum in the stimuli that we selected. In the unisensory case, we saw that there were areas in the visual and the auditory modality in which the perceptual judgments correlated with the neural response. And we also found that perhaps both visual and auditory modalities could be involved when processing sound symbolic cross-modal correspondences, even in a unisensory session. So that was kind of interesting. And then in the multisensory session, we found that there were areas that were attributed to motor and language processes, and these were correlated to processing sound symbolic cross-modal correspondences. And there is some overlap between the multisensory and the unimodal results. I have a figure for that, but for the sake of time, we're going to move past that. But I want to return just for a second to the question of, okay, why might a motor area have appeared for something, a perceptual phenomenon that seems primarily associated with auditory and visual sensation? And there are probably many ways to try to explain that, one of which is that in order to make sounds, you have there's a correlation between how you have to configure your mouth and lips and tongue, in your vocal apparatus, essentially, in order to make those sounds. And it's possible that there may be a sensory connection between how you motorically configure your mouth and lips and tongue in order to make those sounds, and the visual representation of them. So for instance, if I'm saying molo and making sort of an O shape with my mouth, it's possible that the motor configuration is in some way connected to the visual or the sound representation of that O sound. This is sort of an interesting theory, and one that we'll talk about again shortly. So now that I've talked about our perceptual phenomena, the physical properties that may elicit this type of perceptual phenomena, some of the neural correlates that may be important for it, I want to talk about some about individual variation. So we already know, based on some work in our lab that Simon and Maggie did, as well as others, that there are certain people with different perceptual experiences, such as those with synesthesia and dyslexia, who show differences in how they perceive sound symbolic cross-modal correspondences. And so we're asking here, how much variation exists in the strengths of sound-to-meaning correspondences? And perhaps by understanding the natural variation in perception, we could improve models for understanding perception, and also maybe improved sensory substitution devices, something a little more out there. So I want to talk about the task that we had people doing in the multisensory session again, and just say that it's a known principle in the multisensory field that if individuals have a set of matching and mismatching stimuli, and their response time difference is faster for the matching case than it is for the mismatching or the incongruent case, then we sort of use that as a behavioral measure to indicate whether they are combining these auditory visual stimuli or not. So if they're combining them, then they should be faster in the matching or the congruent case. And then we took our reaction times and we did a measurement to normalize them, which is just the sum over the difference. But broadly, the greater than 0 case indicates that they are faster for the match or the congruent trials, and here they were faster for the incongruent trials. So we took the response times that we got from inside the scanner, and these are all our different individual subjects. They're very accurate at this task, and most of them were seeming to integrate the stimuli, so most but not all individuals exhibited a sound symbolic mapping, but you can see some interesting variation here. And then I also want to just remind everyone too that because we had everyone rating 12 different shapes and 12 different pseudowords multiple times, we were also able to compare for each individual how similar their perceptual shapes judgments were to their perceptual pseudoword judgments, and using the second order correlation. So just to remind everyone, for shapes and pseudowords, if they were rating them similarly, then they would have gotten a value above 0, and for less similarly rated judgments, this would be below 0. And we again have our subjects lined up here on the x-axis, and we also can see that they're, most of them at least, are making these sound symbolic associations. And I want to just close with a sort of interesting little tidbit that we have about synesthesia. So in asking the question how much variation exists in the strengths of sound meaning across modal correspondences, I mentioned briefly that those with synesthesia seem to show differences in how they perceive this mapping. So for those who may not know what synesthesia is, there are many types of synesthesia. But one type is grapheme color, in which they see or experience particular colors for particular letters and or numbers, sometimes sound. But you can see this example here. You might have a synesthete who has a particular shade of purple for all the S's, a particular shade of blue for all the E's. And there are different colors for different letters. And so we actually did scan one synesthete, grapheme color synesthete, who was able to show us maybe some interesting things. I have here displayed our multisensory results, so that again the areas that preferred congruent or matching over incongruent or mismatching, and the red is the group. Blue is one typical individual, and green is the synesthetic individual. So you could probably gain a lot of interesting insight from this. But one thing that just stood out to me is that there is some interesting occipital lobe correlated with visual function activity. But we also see significant overlap, particularly in our large pre to post central area that appeared with the typical group as well. So there may be important differences, but also significant similarity between the synesthete and the group. And if we were to be able to recruit many more synesthetes, we might be able to further probe the question that there is a neural basis to the articulatory explanation of sound symbolism. Some have even posited that it may be a very low level of sensory to motor synesthesia. So that's an interesting possibility and just something that I wanted to sort of close with. So I'm going to sort of step out a little bit and now bring this all back to what was our original question? Why is there non-arbitrariness in language? We used this perceptual phenomena of sound symbolic cross-modal correspondences to dig into that. We looked at this phenomena in 3 different ways. So we looked at the physical aspects of it, we looked at the neural correlates of it, and we looked at some individual variation. And just to sort of broad brush what those different things showed us, so a consistent set of physical features in auditory space could relate to a set of features in visual space to elicit cross-modal correspondences. We looked at some particular neural areas that may functionally correlate with processing sound to meaning cross-modal correspondences. We saw that there is significant variation in sensitivity to cross-modal correspondences, which could maybe reflect differences in perceptual ability or experience. And so I want to kind of now take sort of the wide bird's eye view of this and ask, so we've seen all of these things in relation to sound symbolic cross-modal correspondences, and what can this actually tell us about why there might be non-arbitrariness in language? And I'll say that the long and short of it is that we've created a lot more questions than we've answered, as is the nature of science. I also want to say that language is very complex, so I'm in no way trying to explain all of language by talking about this. But I think that something that sound symbolic cross-modal correspondences could maybe show us is that this perceptual phenomena, and more broadly non-arbitrariness in language, could act as an interesting perceptual bridge. So if all of us have similar types of perceptual mappings between different senses, particularly between audition and vision, if we're trying to describe a visual phenomena, it's possible that we could use these common perceptual mappings to use sound to describe vision. And I think that that could be an interesting glimpse maybe into the evolution of language. So going from individuals to groups of people who are able to express ideas and communicate together. If we have a few examples of a perceptual bridge, maybe that could help us move into an area where we have arbitrariness, where we have something that expands into huge vocabularies, but maybe we had to start small with these non-arbitrary associations. So as I wrap up, good on time, I just want to sort of give an idea of some of the things that have come out of this work. So we're developing, or have developed, 2 first author papers, one under review and one in prep. I gave 6 poster presentation talks about our work, optimized 2 separate behavioral paradigms to test sound symbolic cross-modal correspondences, helped pioneer the use of programs like MATLAB and SPM in our labs, tested methods like sparse sampling to help improve our data analysis and multivariate analysis to help improve our pipelines, became certified and in operating the MRI, thanks again to Kate for our rebel for that. Contributed as a fellow in a couple of different programs. Served as an assistant peer reviewer for 4 articles in scientific journals. Mentored several undergraduates. And all in the middle of this, we moved labs, so I learned some interesting skills about how to keep the lab running even while we're moving to different places and learning how to communicate remotely. So this has actually been a huge team effort, though. So there's a couple of different things that I've learned that as a graduate student, you really remember what your mentor says. And one is a story that I have from when we were at a SFN, a conference that we typically go to. We were looking for a particular video that apparently exists of Chris dancing. And he turned to me, because we couldn't quite find the video, and said, "Not until you win your PhD." And so that has, in some cases, kind of motivated me. And so I'm going to be asking about that. But another thing that Krishna said many times is that if you want to go fast, go alone, and if you want to go far, go together. This is an African proverb that he shared many times, and I just want to take a moment to point out all of the people who have been a huge part of my experience at Emory, including everyone who has been here today, just watching this online. It's been an incredible journey. My family, most of them are here, and one's in Germany. Hi, Rachel. And I want to point out my lab group. I also want to point out some people who are no longer with us, but who would be incredibly proud. My grandmother here passed away last summer. My dog, and we went to some amazing places together, and I think we really did go far. I don't have time to mention all of the wonderful people who have been a part of this today, but I do want to point out this person right here who may have at times seemed like the tech person. He's my partner, Edwin. And he has really been an integral part of encouragement and support throughout this process. And of course, I want to thank my main mentoring team, the core of my science, Dr. Chris Sathian, Dr. Lynn Nygaard, and Dr. Simon Lacey. You have been through a lot. We've all been through a lot together, and it's been a wonderful journey. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions from non-committee members.
So Sarah, your kind of post-central, pre-central result there, you attributed it to a kind of an oral motor mapping, which I think is really plausible and is in the literature. Are you able to rule out something simpler or dumber, like some kind of response bias or response time effect that could be causing mismatch differences?
That's a great question, and was actually maybe one of our first questions. Of course, is was there some sort of difference in terms of them just selecting buttons? To that, I would say that interestingly, that we got some overlap in the unisensory session. I didn't show this data, but we got some overlap with that area in the unisensory sessions, in which we actually took out all of the trials in which they were using the response box. I'd also say too that there was not really overlap in what would be considered the hand region of the primary motor cortex. So although that still may be possible, it's maybe less likely with our set of data. Thank you.
This may be kind of a related question, but your stimuli are auditory and visual. What do you think would happen if you had them touching something pointy or smooth?
Oh,
as far as, I mean, I know there's probably some literature on that, but as far as bringing that into like what you would see in your studies, what would be different and what would be the same?
That's a great question. I mean, I'm sure that we would see some interesting tactile areas, and I will say that our lab has done some great work in terms of tactile sensation and also with blind individuals.
Right.
I think that it's possible, though, that you could get increased visual activity. You could. Sometimes there is an explanation of tactile stimulation increasing visual activity. So that's a great point too. That actually, I'm not trying to make the case that auditory and visual sensation are unique in the possibility that there may be connections between the two, and that there is significant work showing that there are connections across other senses like tactile, vibrotactile sensation and vision, and particularly vision, which seems, I think, for humans to be a pretty dominant sense or dominant sort of feature. That's a great question. Thank you.
Okay, well, let's thank Sarah again. So now we'll have the closed session, which is just for the committee, and assuming everything goes well, the reception will be.
Will be Whitehall.
Whitehead 400 at.
Whitehead 400.
So just straight up the elevators.
At noon.
At
At
noon.
noon. Yes.
Sarah. All right, we're gonna go off the live stream now, guys. Thanks for joining, everyone. Woo.